On the 14th of September 2008, Aeroflot-Nord Flight 821 was on its final approach to the Russian city of Perm. The flight seemed to be going smoothly, but as they approached the airport, something went wrong. Air traffic controllers noticed that the aircraft was straying off course. The plane failed to follow instructions to descend. Instead, it climbed higher. This failure will lead to a critical situation that would ultimately determine if the flight crew and passengers would reach their destination. Welcome to another amazing episode. In today's video, we travel back in time to examine Aeroflot-Nord Flight 821's story, a 16-year-old Boeing 737-505 registered as VP BKO. The regularly scheduled domestic passenger flight departed Moscow's Sheremetyevo Airport, SVO, for Perm International Airport, PE, with 6 crew members and 82 passengers on board. In the early hours of the 13th of September 2008, the crew of Aeroflot-Nord Flight 821, consisting of 2 pilots and 4 cabin crew members, arrived at Moscow's Sheremetyevo Airport at around 1:30 a.m. The 2 pilots, Captain Rodion Medvedev and First Officer Rustam Aliberdin, had over 12,000 flight hours between them. However, they had limited experience with the Boeing 737. Of Captain Medvedev's 3,689 total hours, only 713 were on the 737. Similarly, First Officer Aliberdin had just 219 of his 8,713 flight hours on the 737 model. Medvedev had spent most of his career flying the Tupolev Tu-134 and failed exams to become a captain while flying it. In comparison, Aliberdin had experience with the Antonov An-2, a single-engine biplane commonly used for crop dusting. The 2 pilots traveled to the United States for 737 training. Instructors taught them in English, a language they were not very proficient in. Aliberdin knew no English before the course, and afterward, the evaluators deemed his language skills insufficient to operate an aircraft, relying solely on English documentation. On top of that, Medvedev returned to flying the Tu-134 for several months, after getting his 737 training before transitioning to the 737, reducing his already limited knowledge of the aircraft. Furthermore, the trainers designed his program for first officers, and his file needed more documentation. Both pilots demonstrated poor crew resource management, probably because neither pilot had experience flying in a 2-crew cockpit. The Tu-134 required 4 pilots, and the An-2 generally needed 1. As a result, their 737 training in Russia and the United States did not meet Russia's legal norms. One detail in Aliberdin's training stood out on the night of Flight 821. During training, he demonstrated a complete inability to comprehend how a 2-engine plane would behave if its engines produced varying thrust levels. Coincidentally, the Boeing 737 had this same problem. The right engine tended to deliver around 20% more thrust than the left engine. That imbalance caused the plane to pull to the left since the right engine pushed the right wing quicker than the left engine pushed the left wing, even when both engines had the same power settings. To compensate for this, the throttle levers had to be offset from one another to balance the actual thrust outputs of both engines. Typically, the auto throttles would do this, but this created another issue. With a thrust split of more than 700 pounds, the autothrottle would disengage under specific control surface settings. When this occurred, the pilots had to occasionally steer the airplane straight again using the flight controls because they couldn't precisely stagger the throttle levers on their own due to continuous swings in the amount of the disparity. Previous flight crews had raised concerns about this issue, which began 1 month before the flight, but maintenance personnel did not attempt to resolve it. Nonetheless, any experienced pilot should have been able to handle the situation. However, Aliberdin had little experience with the Boeing 737. But a more severe issue affected Flight 821. Captain Medvedev had been drinking the night before the trip. It's unclear how much he drank or how long before the flight he did so, but by the time he boarded the plane, he was still clearly drunk. Before reporting for Flight 821, the captain rested for approximately 15 hours before reporting for Flight 821, exceeding the minimal requirement. But during the preceding 3 days, he had worked long night flights and violated minimal rest regulations, perhaps causing cumulative weariness. On one occasion, he only rested for 6 hours instead of 12. Despite these concerns, the flight procedures proceeded normally. The first officer arrived with 3 cabin crew members. Shortly after, the captain came in with the remaining crew members. The crew went through standard medical examinations, which they all passed. They then went to the crew room to review pre-flight documentation. The pilots reviewed the weather and NOTAMs and found conditions acceptable. The weather forecast predicted rain and mist at their destination, but not severe enough to raise concerns. They headed out to Stand 22 and prepared the aircraft for departure. The captain examined the tech log and noticed the crew needed to disengage the inoperative auto throttle. Since there were no technical personnel to consult, the captain presumably assumed that the equipment was functional until it failed. Although we could not confirm whether the crew followed standard operating procedures, they discovered that someone activated the inoperative auto throttle just before departure, contrary to the established guidelines. After everyone was ready, the captain issued a welcoming PA to the passengers, but the first officer requested pushback. At 3:06 local time, the aircraft began taxiing out for departure from runway 07 left. Somehow the flight took off from Moscow and flew to Perm, with the auto throttle continually adjusting for the asymmetric thrust. Captain Medvedev, conscious of his deteriorating mental health, delegated nearly all of the flying tasks to Alaberdeen. Throughout the cruise, the flight proceeded without any significant issues. At approximately 200 kilometers from Perm Airport, the pilots debated which arrival and approach they would be flying. The first officer tried to load the arrival and approach routing into the flight management computer, but they were not available from the FMC memory, so he had to program the waypoints himself, which he had huge problems with. He didn't seem to understand the logic behind FMC programming. As a result, the work took a lot longer than expected, which made him turn to the captain for help. Afterward, the captain requested to begin the descent by calling the air traffic controller. In response, the controller gave them the all-clear to descend to 4,500 meters, or roughly 14,000 feet at first, and to get in touch with the approach controller once they reached 5,100 meters. However, another serious infraction occurred when the captain failed to cross-check the newly cleared altitude set by the first officer in the mode control panel. Throughout the descent, there were further omissions of this kind and a general lack of notifications about autopilot mode changes, FMA modifications, and clearances. Furthermore, it appeared that the crew did not apply any critical safety measures developed in response to previous incidents in the cockpit. In addition to these procedural mistakes, the captain also committed several odd little errors, such as mispronouncing their call sign and citing inaccurate heights for pressurization checks, which suggested that he wasn't performing at his highest level. On top of these, the pilots broke the requirement of maintaining a sterile cockpit by trash-talking the cabin crew and the air traffic controller about non-operational topics during the descent without apparent justification. There was no thrust imbalance because the autopilot settings were set to idle descent, but this will soon change. After a while, the captain would instruct the first officer to monitor the radio indicating that he was taking control. In addition to monitoring the engine, the pilot occasionally makes control inputs and turns on anti-ice while sporadically making control inputs. A fundamental concept when operating in a two-pilot cockpit in the case of the Boeing 737 is adherence to areas of responsibility. Crew members follow this procedure to reduce uncertainty and minimize confusion about their responsibilities and the timing of their actions. But that didn't happen here. Despite this, the aircraft passed 5,100 meters. and the first officer, presumably handling both pilot flying and pilot monitoring at that time, reported this to the air traffic controller, who instructed him to get in touch with the Perm approach controller on a different frequency. After checking in, the air traffic controller instructed the first officer to descend to 2,700 meters and follow the Mendeleevo 4B arrival route. While the first officer correctly read back the altitude clearance, he returned the Mendeleevo 4A arrival, which he had incorrectly prepared for in the flight management computer. Despite the air traffic controller providing the correct clearance, the first officer remained confused. Due to this, the arrival route would require the crew to fly the plane differently than usual. Instead of approaching the landing runway 03, the aircraft would fly over a specific beacon PX and then turn towards the ILS for the runway. For context, the ILS is a system that helps them line up with the runway. The new arrival route would involve these extra steps, different from the usual approach the crew had prepared for earlier. They planned on arriving via a much easier direct path to a location known as Sinra, and then turning towards the ILS, which is the route they would typically take. Even though this arrival was different, the crew did not conduct a follow-up briefing. This unusual arrival path was because a Lufthansa Airbus A319, which was about to take off from Perm, had requested to take off on runway 03 because there was a slight tailwind on runway 21. At this point, the crew began debating how to operate this new route. As the pilots were having this conversation, a cabin crew member interrupted them to point them that the fasten seatbelt indicator was still off. It was time to put that on, but the captain said it was too early. Instead, the captain requested a cup of tea from the cabin crew members. At 4:50 a.m., the air traffic controller came in and explained the reasons behind the altered arrival route to the crew. Aeroflot 821, expect approach via outer marker, and for your information, aircraft lining up for departure. Wind not suitable for it, heading 212. This explanation was probably complicated for the crew, making things more confusing. The captain and the air traffic controller discussed the wind conditions for runway 21, with the controller informing the captain of a tailwind. The captain confirmed that the tailwind was acceptable for their flight. After some back and forth, the captain confirmed the new course to the outer marker PX, but it was unclear whether this was via the previously cleared arrival route or directly to it. After 5 a.m., communication in the cockpit started to deteriorate. The captain mistakenly referred to the flight using incorrect numbers, and his language became more informal and crude. The first officer prepared the plane for landing, but the specific conditions caused the autothrottle to disengage as they approached the runway. The aircraft began banking left without the autothrottle, compensating for the overpowered right engine. First, Officer Alaberdine reacted to the left bank by turning his wheel to the right, pushing it forward to descend, and moving the pitch trim into a nose-down position even though it was unnecessary. This combination of inputs caused the autopilot to disengage completely, but neither pilot appeared to understand this despite an obvious autopilot disconnect warning. However, upon seeing the warning, Alaberdine stopped making his control inputs. The plane was now without a pilot, and they didn't touch the controls for 25 seconds. The plane drifted left again and began climbing without any input from the pilots or the autopilot, which was the opposite of what they needed to do to get to the airport. The air traffic controller noticed that the plane was climbing instead of descending and asked the pilots to confirm. The captain acknowledged the mistake, but it was too late to intercept the glide slope. The controller ordered the plane to go around and try the approach again, but the pilots did not obey the command. When asked if everything was all right in the cockpit, the captain assured the controller it was. But in fact, the situation in the cockpit was rapidly spiraling out of control. Alaberdine finally noticed that the plane was banking left and climbing, but he barely understood why and knew he could not fly with asymmetric thrust. He yelled to Medvedev, "Take it! Take it!" Medvedev was in no fit state to fly, however. "Take what?" he said. "I can't do it either." But his petrified first officer insisted. As soon as Medvedev took control of the plane, he sealed the fate of everyone on board. His judgment and memory clouded by alcohol, he reverted to the familiar mindset of flying the Tupolev Tu-134. One key difference between the Tu-134 and the 737 was how their attitude, bank angle indicators worked. The Tu-134 displayed a bank angle by tilting the figure of a plane against a static horizon, while the 737 kept the figure of the aircraft static while the horizon tilted. Medvedev likely noticed the horizon appeared tilted to the right and thought this meant they were turning right. Unsure which way Medvedev thought they needed to bank, he turned left, making the bank even worse. Alabardine immediately yelled, "Other way, other way," and a bank angle warning sounded in the cockpit. Before Medvedev could take the hint, the plane rolled over and entered a dive. The air traffic controller tried to contact the pilots again, but the only response was a terrified scream. Seconds later, he caught sight of the plane plunging out of the clouds and witnessed it plow nose first into the ground, triggering a massive explosion. Aeroflot-Nord Flight 821 had crashed into a section of the Trans-Siberian Railway on the outskirts of Perm, instantly killing all 88 people on board. As it crashed, the aircraft impacted a part of the Trans-Siberian Railway which was severely damaged, but no one on the ground was hurt. Rescue personnel and firefighters quickly located the crashed plane near the airport but could only secure the area and search for the black boxes which were severely damaged when they found them. When investigators accessed them, the cockpit voice recording made no sense, but they were able to see it in a new light after discovering a passenger's text about the captain being drunk. The investigators ordered toxicology tests on the captain's body and discovered alcohol in Medvedev's bloodstream. There was no doubt about it. The captain of Flight 821 was drunk throughout the flight. Medvedev was aware that his intoxication made it impossible for him to fly, and he delegated his responsibilities to Alabardine. But he was unable to operate the flight on his own, and when events spiraled out of control, his drunk captain was the only person he had to turn to. At that point, neither pilot could recover the plane. Everyone on board was simply along for the ride. Immediately after the accident, Aeroflot-Nord had said that Alabardine and Medvedev were two of its best pilots, a statement that it later regretted as it turned out that the airline was barely aware that its experienced pilots were woefully unprepared to fly the Boeing 737. The investigation revealed significant safety lapses by Russian aviation authorities, the airline, maintenance organization, and air traffic controllers. The investigative team issued 40 safety recommendations to address the issue, including improved pilot training, English proficiency verification, and enhanced transition training for pilots moving from Soviet to Western aircraft. On the recommendation of the investigation into the crash of Flight 821, Russian airlines have taken significant steps to overhaul their training regimes to ensure that pilots stop making the sort of egregious blunders that caused many of the most high-profile accidents in Russia. Following the disaster, Aeroflot sold Aeroflot-Nord, which changed its name to Nordavia in 2009 and then Smartavia in 2019. Neither airline has experienced an accident since. Although there has been a decrease in crashes in Russia, partly due to lessons learned from Flight 821, only time will tell the extent of the additional efforts required to further enhance aviation safety. Thanks for sticking with this video till the very end. If you enjoyed this video and wish to see more of such videos, please subscribe to this channel. Also, remember to like and share this video content. Thanks again for watching.